Good morning, everyone. Uh, Welcome to day 2. I believe it's been power-packed, very deep and broad-ranging discussions since yesterday morning with the inaugural. I am the chair of this session. I head the School of International Affairs here. It's a privilege to have 7 outstanding speakers on this panel. So in the hour and a half that we have, if I do my math correctly, it should be 10 minutes per speaker, and then maybe we can have 20 minutes for Q&A with the audience. The introductions of the speakers are on the brochures in front of you, so you may please refer to them, but I'll also briefly introduce them. But before that, just on the overall theme, it's an intriguing title for this session, if you have noticed. The subtitle, Collaboration or Competition, maybe there should be a question mark there. And what is intended by this? Because we tend to think that this is all, a happy cooperative experience, and all the time universities should get along with other universities, and scholars should get along with other scholars, and it should be uninterrupted, bonhomie. But then the element of competition has been introduced in the session, and I'll request the speakers to perhaps reflect on that, because we are often choosy about who we collaborate with. And there is also some sense of a rivalry among universities, which should not be brushed under the carpet with regard to research and research grants and winning prestigious awards, and also, of course, the rankings, which are closely associated with research output and research success. And many of us have room to work with other universities, but at the same time are fiercely loyal to our own institutions and want our own institutions to be doing significantly better than other ones. So it's a competitive environment as well. But at the outset, internationalization research generally, internationalization. My colleague Professor Kalyani is here, and she actually runs our international office. It's primarily devoted to student mobility and student opportunities, and less so to research. But of course, we know that there are research projects that are conducted jointly by multiple institutions on the basis of shared vision. Just yesterday, all evening I was on television with the UN General Assembly debates. And in a way, this is a microcosm of the bigger real world, where we talk about cooperation and, the world is one family and, one village and all that. But then there is also a sense of narrower national interests and cooperation and competition. So these two coexist, and that's the reality. But let me kickstart. I request Professor Kavita Sharma, who's the president of South Asian University, one of the leading scholars in this field. She's written a book on internationalization. I refer you to read. And ma'am, recently I was at South Asian University, and you spoke about the Mahabharata and the Indian epics and their impact on the way the world works. So clearly, she's one of the cutting-edge thinkers on non-Western paradigms and epistemology. Very important for us here, as this is happening in India, although it's a global university. So, ma'am, floor is with you first.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here at the O.P. Jindal University. First, let me congratulate the Jindal University on its 10th anniversary. Made remarkable progress in 10 years. So I think we need to congratulate the Vice Chancellor, the faculty, and the students, and I think the management, which has allowed you to do all this. Now, I'm going to just bullet point very quickly what I have to say, because I don't think it's so clear-cut about competition and collaboration. There are points at which we meet, and then there are points at which we don't meet. Now, basically, we want, Europe, for example, has said that by 2020, 20% of the students should have an international experience, at least a study abroad program. So mobility, why mobility? Mobility for better learning. right? And so what is this policy that is pertaining to internationalization? Student and staff mobility. We keep thinking in terms of student mobility, but I think staff mobility is very, very important, especially the mid-level staff, which has a stake, longer stake in the higher, in the university. Internationalism and improvement of curricula, plus digital learning. Nowadays, I'm obsessed by this artificial learning, because I think the universities will completely change. I'm not even sure whether we'll need buildings and how many buildings and what, because that will be another way of internationalization. Customized syllabi for individual students, meta-universities, you can take different courses from different universities. So what will be the role of the parent university? How will it collaborate? How will it recognize these courses? How will it recognize each other's? So I think we need to stop thinking only in terms of mobility in that sense. And we, of course, have strategic cooperative partnerships for capacity building. 1990s was the time when internationalized, and I won't go into UN debates and etc. on it, but international education is not internationalization. That started much before this buzzword of internationalization. We were already studying multicultural education, peace education, international relations. Area studies started in UGC so many years ago. But of course, we use it now as internationalization. That poor international education has somewhere sunk into the, into the mire. Internationalization at home is very necessary. And I keep saying this in the Indian context. 88% of our universities are state universities, which have jurisdictional problems. So if people from different parts of India don't live together in those state universities, how can you just put people from abroad into those state universities? Initially, primarily, the focus was on cooperation. I remember early 70s, all our PL 480 funds, which, when US gave us wheat aid and food aid, etc., those funds were never taken back by US. They were used to put in institutions in place. And there were huge number of faculty members who came to India from US to teach here. I have statistics somewhere on how many thousands of man-hours were spent here and how many faculty from India went to US to study there. Then UK and Australia started to move from aid to trade, and then full fee-paying students. And then studies were done on how many full fee-paying students will lead to one full-time faculty member. So commercialization became a key. Then offshore education, branch campuses all started, shift from student and teachers to programs and universities. Many countries declared themselves to be international education hubs, Singapore, Malaysia. Well, Hong Kong is in a mess, but Hong Kong was one of them. And now Vietnam, South Africa, they're all recruiting for international. So commercialization has taken place. In fact, I love that phrase, there is a globalization of internationalization. So,
It's actually a book now.
Is there?
Globalization of international.
Oh, is that right? I picked it up from somewhere, but so, everyone is into this internationalization. Now, there is a realization that we will need to build quality. Otherwise, the parent institution will suffer as far as offshore and branch campuses are concerned. So, better selection of students, don't just take them in for money. Accreditation, facilitate counseling and guidance for international students. Somebody was asking me, what do I do about 7 country students? Well, I have to put it into place. And their standards are very uneven. I get students so my perception of internationalization is completely different from probably what would exist as I see the table around me in OP Jindal University. So my thing about research is it only going to be research in English education published in Western journals? Impact factors, is that what we are looking at? So what will happen to all these different countries? Will we have no place for regional languages? Will we have no place for regional publishing? How are we going to benchmark all of that? So I think this north, south, east, west Boundaries are blurring, will blur even more. In 10 years, there will be countries who are sending students outside, will be receiving students from outside. And so, also, this competition that has got set up is also, you have a lot of contradictions there. National priority versus international. You are producing, and this is the thing about IITs and places like AIMS. The Indian taxpayer has paid so much money to send people to US or to UK. So then in national priorities to international trends, government steering. Now, my university, I have 8 governments. It's bad enough to deal with one government. I have 8 governments to contend with. Really. And they never seem to agree on anything, and 2 governments don't even talk to each other. But I have students from everywhere, and everyone needs to be looked after. Government steering versus institutional autonomy, diversification or homogenization. What is going to happen? So competition will happen or collaboration will happen. Can we just go on competing? We are going to ruin education if we just go on competing. Somewhere the collaboration will happen. Open source or international or intellectual property rights. What is it going to be? Of course, different institutions, different syllabi, different disciplines will have different strategies for internationalization. You were talking about my work on Indian knowledge systems. I think that is something unique in India, which we are destroying, but which will be of great interest not only to outside but to ourselves. It is our poor Adivasis, our tribal people who have kept your forests alive, your mountains alive, your rivers alive, your diversity of crops alive, your diversity of seeds alive. There's also, coming to academic, there's also a finding the more educated you get in our institutions, the fewer the languages you speak and ability to learn. So this all will have to be thought through. 3 questions. Is the concept of internationalization keeping pace with the development? Yes. Higher education? I've already talked of customized curriculum, etc. Is there a shared understanding of what is internationalization, or we are just all talking? And have we lost sight of why internationalization? So often cooperation and competition meet, as in my university, South Asian University, but at a larger aim is also that let's not send students to the West, let's create an academically excellent institution here. Of course, there will always be global competition for talent. There will always be branch campuses, hopefully on both sides, and not just on one side. There will be increasing complexity of cross-border activity, and more payment agents, I hope not, are increasing to recruit students. So I will stop here, but I think for internationalization to take place, it will have to be ethical, it will have to be more equitable, it will have to be more responsible, and it will have to be sustainable. You cannot open a branch campus and then say, oops, sorry. This is what's happened in Dubai to a couple of universities in that knowledge city. So with these few questions, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sharma. I think you really set us some good binaries to think about this or that. Especially your comment about commercialization is worth discussing, because for some, the market logic has become so pervasive that internationalization is coterminous with getting fee-paying students and nothing else from abroad. So we'll come back to that. Next, since Jindal is hosting, I am juggling the order and requesting the distinguished visiting speakers first. I'll request Ms. Manjula Rao of the British Council. She heads a very important arm of the British cultural diplomacy, from which many of us individually have benefited in our careers. I am a Radhakrishnan scholar, and Professor Rajkumar is a Rhodes Scholar, and there are probably many others in this room who have come out of the, the largesse of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and their associated institutions. And the British Council has very high respect and regard in India, and especially their fantastic library, and many of us students are quite familiar with it. But they also promote study abroad, and perhaps she may wish to link and segue from Professor Kavita Sharma's points about the commercialization and the ethical aspects as well as quality, because there seem to be hundreds and hundreds of universities vying for students and for short-term study, for degree programs and such things, and the essential element of choice may have expanded, but it seems there's also a great deal of malpractice, and esteemed institutions like yours help as intermediaries to match students with good universities and maybe to promote research as well through research grants as part of the cultural diplomacy. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and I'm really delighted to be here. My first visit to OP Jindal, a long overdue visit, and also pleased that this conversation is happening, Universities of the Future. I think it's the right time for it to take place because we have this draft national education policy. It puts a lot of things into perspective and the direction of travel. And I'm very optimistic that in the context of the NEP, a lot is going to change. This is going to be a moment for us to reflect about what's gone on and what the future will look like. I will comment on some of the points that Professor Kavita Sharma has raised. But before I do that, I just want to make a few comments on internationalization, our experience of being in India for 70 years as British Council, and my own experience has been for 30 years of those 70 years. And core to all of our work, whether we call it internationalization or not, was really about internationalization. It was student mobility, collaborative research throughout. So just talking about internationalization, I just want to make a few observations. I think a vast majority of Indian institutions are still domestically focused. It's only a small percentage of institutions that really focus on internationalization. To this vast majority, internationalization is an alien concept. It's not something that they're actively thinking about. And if you look at the history of internationalization, I think from the time the country got independence, I mean, if you look at the way IITs were set up, it was with international collaboration. That was 50, 60, almost 70 years ago. But the new private institutions here are setting themselves up to be international, whereas there are some of the older public institutions which are aspiring to be international. So there is that difference in evolution, some being set up as international universities and others who are aspiring to be. I think about 10 or 15 years ago, if you look at when internationalization really became the buzzword and people started thinking about it, some of the lesser known engineering management institutions tried to internationalize through what is called transnational education, so twinning programs where students had opportunities for mobility. Many of these were unsuccessful and unsustainable, and the reasons for that is regulation, quality assurance, the economics, and the markets. So I think we need to learn from some of those lessons. And student mobility, when we talk about it, has been unidirectional. It's been from India to the UK, to US, and some of these countries. More recently, I think there are multiple destinations that have come up. I mean, the last figure that I heard of, about 586,000 students go from India each year, or they went last year to international destinations. And we only receive about 45,000 students to India. And that too fully funded, most of them fully funded, really. So we haven't been an attractive destination, and we need to think about why. Also, a lot of these mobility programs, which are government funded, are unsustainable. You can't keep funding large numbers of students. So again, I mean, when you talk of mobility, I think you haven't fully exploited other opportunities which don't necessarily involve physical mobility, or at least the physical mobility is only for a shorter duration and therefore costs a bit less. So I would like this group to think about how do we fully explore and exploit internationalization, and the fact that India has always looked to the West and English-speaking countries, and do we aspire to hold a leadership position and become a hub, and also work much more closely with the less developed countries. I think we're still, there's some attempt, but I don't think we're doing enough of that. Your university is an example of that, where we have begun. I think, talking about research, and I will end with that, because student mobility, we quickly, when we talk of internationalization, we quickly move to student mobility, because I think that's where a lot of action is. But there is a lot of research collaboration that's happening. And if you ask any UK university, and especially senior leadership positions, what their primary interest is, it is research collaboration. And I'm slightly intrigued. I mean, the collaborations usually are very useful, and I can give you data maybe in the question-answer session about how UK has benefited from these collaborations, both in terms of their citation index and others. So just want to say that, yeah, I think we have to think of research performance, and that's definitely increased. This is primarily driven by bilateral funding in the case of UK. Newton Baba and UKERI, the UK India Education and Research Initiative partnerships, have really played a big role in building those relationships between UK and Indian institutions. At the last count, we have over 1,000 of these partnerships that were supported with 25,000 faculty mobility. I'm not talking about student mobility. If you count that, that runs into tens of thousands. And we haven't really heard anything about, it's competitive. I think everybody who has worked on these programs believe that there have been benefits. Okay. So I'm not going to touch on the competition yet. Very quickly on commercialization and ethics, I think markets are definitely driving this. Universities and the fact that the resources have become limited has driven to commercialization. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Agents, education agents, are playing a big role in, driving some of these markets, and I think we need to take cognizance of that. On the part of the British Council, we do try and train counselors and agents to the best of our ability to talk about these issues, but anyway, it's an open market, so I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Manjulaji. I think Manjulaji raised a very important point about why India has not been an attractive destination, even talking about inbound foreign students, not many. 45,000, is that the statistic we have? So for a country with 800 plus universities, 45,000 is quite abysmal in terms of incoming students. And I was just looking up, the HRD ministry announced the Study in India program in 2018. And perhaps some of you in the audience have already started implementing that government-supported thing in some of your institutions, and we would like to know how well this state-funded and subsidized Study in India program is working. Will it, developing countries struggle with lots of things. Now, just to give you a parallel, our Prime Minister is talking about, multiplying exports as very, very significant cornerstone for improving the economic growth, and to revive it to a double-digit level and to make it a $5 trillion economy. Now, even for that, there are lots of state schemes and incentives which are announced and which are supposed to, spur manufacturing that leads to export. But then the question is, from the point of the policy to the point of the to walking the talk, there's huge gap, and always we fall short. So clearly, the same probably applies to Study in India, and maybe we should talk about that and why it hasn't really yielded the intended benefits yet. Moving on. Now we have the Jindal lineup, but even in Jindal lineup, I'm going to start with a very special person, a very, very senior scholar who was our first pro vice chancellor, Professor D.K. Srivastava. He's a legend in the field of law, and I have lost count of how many books he has written, but his bio is actually very modest for his achievements. So while he's talking, I request you to glance at his bio. He has taught in a number of countries And in fact, he has built up law departments in countries where most of us have never even set foot, like Papua New Guinea. So he's a legend in the field and has been thinking and involved in internationalization and research for a long time, and has been an administrator as well as a top scholar in the legal field. So please, DK, over to you.
Well, thank you, Sriram, my old friend and guide in many respects. I just want to say in 50 seconds what I feel now. I was here for 3 years, and at that time, I was collaborating in research in some way or the other. Like I wrote or made the first draft of ordinances, statutes, and so on. But that was not, I was not the only one who did it. I wrote the first one, then we had this, our legal advisor, we talked to him, and it went on, and then it was passed by the government of Haryana. So some kind of collaboration I have always done. And I will tell you, if I tell you my life history, that will explain more what collaboration and research is. So let me tell that I'm very pleased to come here first. And I was telling Raj last night that I'm mesmerized by the place. It looks like you people have done some magic. I never thought that when I return after 7, 8 years, it will be like that. And all kinds of things. If you look at the picture gallery, my God, what it is like. So, and that is why it is one of the top universities here, and how it is going up and up. I don't think there's any stopping so long as good leadership that exists now remains in existence. So, congratulations to you and your team. Now, my lecture will not be as structured as Kavita Sharma's or Manjula Rao's. I have jotted down some points to make this presentation, and I was trying to write more, but Raj said that, you know, your presentation is a 10. I said, I'm just coming down. What I see, there are two aspects of research collaboration. One is support from the industry, and the other, academic support and collaboration. So far as India is concerned, that collaboration is much less, only about 11%. So far as the States, United States is concerned, it is 80%. So far as Australia is concerned, it is quite a lot. If we talk about collaboration, rich people, they very generously donate money to universities for research and for building and so on. The University of Western Australia, the donor was absolutely, I don't know, a billionaire or what. He has made so much donation that the university will never need to borrow any money for any research or teaching. About 1/3 of Perth, the donor owned, and he has all donated. I find that there is some kind of thing in Australia. People, like I know staff in Monash, they have been working there. In their will, they have said, whatever money remains in my account will go to the university. So that is the kind of donation you get. Monash University was also built on donation where I went first. So that is the way. So one thing I understand that requires is more industrial support. I do not think that you have got too many people like Naveen Jindal. That is the problem here. And we need to somehow have a strategy to talk to more industrialists and persuade them to give money to the universities. Once the culture changes, I'm telling you, things will flow in a different way. People are very good in donating 1,000 kilo of gold to a temple, but not to any university. Now, regarding academic collaboration, if I tell you my own story a bit, what I see as academic collaboration. I studied all my life at Benares Hindu University or schools there until I went to Australia. I did a master's from Benares and published a paper. I can't say that there was no collaboration from my supervisor. He would say that go and read this, go do that, structure it this way. So the collaboration starts where you start doing any research, any writing. Without help, without collaboration, you cannot go anywhere. So that's where it started. I published one piece, then I met someone, and he said that, do you want to come to Monash to teach? Because I'm talking of 1970. I had not had any teaching experience before, and I was quite scared to go and teach Australian students. Particularly, I had a strong Indian accent, and that guy said, no, you will be okay. It is good that you're thinking of coming. Students should have exposure to other people. I went there, started teaching. I had about 2 years. I taught for 2 years. My dean called me, do you really want to stay here? I said, yes. I think it was 1 year, not 2 years. He said, my advice to you will be, get an Australian degree. I said, I've got 8 hours to teach. He said, no, you get Australian degree if you want to stay here and try to publish. I said, okay. So I joined the PhD part-time and started doing research. I had one supervisor. I didn't have success with her. She thought that my way of writing was not that good. Why did I join a PhD? Tell you the truth. So I went and spoke to the dean. He said, a very high standard. She has a very high standard. And she has got certain kind of thinking. So it means you are not compatible. I said, looks like to me. Can I change her? He said, no. She's a big scholar, a great scholar here. How can you change her? She's a royal commissioner. I said, okay. But I said that the way I'm thinking to do my research, she doesn't want me to go that way. I tell you what it is, because it's a book on freedom of religion, comparative research, and so on. And I wanted to talk about, like some of the Indians, about how the whole thing was derived from the Vedas and other religions, and then come to modern times, talk about US, etc. She didn't want to have any historical thing. I said, no, I think that's something which is very important. Then I got another supervisor. He was quite sympathetic. He became a judge of the International Court of Justice. And he guided me through, and he really liked those parts. Just tell you one thing, I'm not trying to beat my own drums, that the chapter on historical analysis of how the freedom of religion evolved in India has been widely cited in India. Even there was a race relations committee of the Senate of India, they have cited, but only that part, historical analysis, which I wanted to do and she didn't want to do. So I had kind of some drum beat, it looks like. And I said, no, I'm going to do it. How much? Only 2 minutes. Oh, I'm not even started. Okay. Okay. What about 4 minutes? Okay. So with all these collaborations in my degree, and then I went to Papua New Guinea, and then I started working on some projects because Papua New Guinea was a virgin territory. And I got projects from them. Then people began, because I wrote 2 books in Papua New Guinea, I was known in Pacific Islands, and 1 book was used in about 10 countries. I returned to returned to Canberra University in Australia, and then I was contacted by the Asia Foundation to do something on Pacific Islands, South Pacific Islands, and they wanted to publish book on legal system of various countries. And they chose me and 11 other professors from Australia, England, America. So it was a lot of collaboration. And we used to meet every 3rd month to decide how to strategize, how to write those chapters. And I did chapters on islands whose names some of you might not have heard. Norfolk Island and Pitcairn Island. It was all the result of collaboration. The book is published from the Hawaii University. So that is how I've been going. And then came to Australia, again started the same thing. Yeah, came to Hong Kong. And there in Hong Kong also, I had a lot of projects funded by the UGC, Raj. With Raj also, I did a couple of projects, and with others as well. And I published all the time. And those publications have resulted from research, sometimes empirical, sometimes otherwise. That is the way it has been done. And so there is collaboration in my research all the time, and that's how it should happen. That's how students should be taught to collaborate. Firstly, you guide them, then as they grow, they become collaborate. And there's one more thing. In Hong Kong, there was no shortage of money. So many, Hong Kong was the richest place when I went there, not anymore. Australia was the richest country when I went there. So that competition that you talk about wasn't much there. Thank you.
You have a way of finding places which are pretty rich.
Thank you, thank you.
University,
Thank you.
How come they become poor the moment?
It's the impact factor of decay. Thank you, Professor Srivastava. Actually, he gave an interesting personal journey of engaging in research in multiple domains. And one of the interesting strains I caught was the colonial or post-colonial divide when it comes to research. And it's interesting because, in science, the story of Subramaniam Chandrasekhar is often told, where he was denied the due recognition of his extraordinary brilliance because of the colonial attitudes of the time, in the 1930s and 40s. And he got the Nobel some 40 years later, long after his initial insight about black holes. And much of it he resented because of the racism inherent in the academe of the West at that time. But I think, as DK is mentioning, it has significantly lessened, and probably it's more collaborative today between North and South than it was several decades ago. Okay, maybe a good segue from that will be my colleague, Dr. Moushami Mukherjee. She heads our Institute for Higher Education Research and has been working on the intercultural and other aspects related to higher education. She's actually a specialist in the field of education. So over to you, Maushami.
Thank you so much, Sriram. And thank you for inviting me, especially after Professor D.K. Srivastava, because as he was sharing some of his experience in Australia, it reminded me of some of my own experiences too. So things have changed, but there are still struggles. And I can share today here openly, one of the members of my doctoral committee at the University of Melbourne, I don't want to mention name, I ran into real trouble. I am very thankful for my main PhD supervisor. Without his support, I could not have even sent my thesis for external examination because I was citing from Tagore. Okay, and she's an educationist, of course, within the Australian context, but she has all her life, she has taught English. She was an English teacher in schools and later on became an academic education researcher. And one day she was like, who is Tagore? So that was a real shock for me because quite interestingly, now there is Australia India Institute at the University of Melbourne, and there's actually a statue, bust of Tagore and Satyajit Ray right in front of Australia India Institute. But this happened through the course of my own doctoral journey in Melbourne. So, and then when I was actually returning from Melbourne, I actually gave her 2 books to read. By the time my thesis went through external examination and my Canadian and American external examiners gave excellent examination report without any revision or anything, one go it got passed. And, so I shared these 2 books written by my former early mentor at Calcutta University on Tagore. And one of them, and she's a feminist, this committee member I had with whom I ran into trouble with Tagore. So, and this book was a feminist, radical Rabindranath, talking about Rabindranath being a man, the kind of radical women's, female characters he wrote about in his novels and short stories. So one of the books was Radical Rabindranath, and we are very good friends now, very good collegial terms, but initially it was a lot of friction. Which when you were sharing, it reminded me of that. So I'm going to, as part of my a reflection on the topic, I'm going to also share some empirical work I did a few years ago. This is actually a little, you can say it's a little dated research because the empirical data is like 10 years old. But if we look at the larger Indian context, not all Indian universities have the kind of setup we have here at OP Jindal Global University. So much of the larger state system and even central universities, public system within the Indian context, I guess, would still have some of these issues that came up through the study. My study actually draws upon earlier research also done in the area of research collaboration. Actually, some of the Australian researcher, and particularly Stephen Ritchie's work, where he studied actually several, the book, the collected edition, it's a Brilliant Sense publication, which was published a few years ago, which presents a number of case studies of successful collaborations and also collaborations which fell apart for some reasons that did not work out very well. Though most of these collaborations and the authors who wrote the case studies, they're coming either from US, Canada, Australia, or some European country. But if you look at the biographical background of these authors, many of them are coming from actually the global south. So it gives a wonderful perspective of what are some of the issues, a theoretical perspective of what are some of the issues that can actually help foster better collaboration, and what are the issues that can, affect collaboration, particularly research collaboration. And the aspects that Richie draws from all these case studies, some of these aspects I'm reading out over here. The success of research collaboration can be discussed in terms of solidarity, emotional energy, trust, agency, power, and ethical praxis. So it has to begin with a sense of solidarity, and that's, and some kind of an emotional agency also Richie talks about over here, and trust and agency, and also the aspect of power, and if and something which came out in the conversation of the previous speaker, and something Sriram was also highlighting, in many cases international relations, IR, historical relations between countries, and even within, the study that I conducted was here in New Delhi, and there are issues even within the Indian context, issues of power relationship, which includes differences in language, caste, class, rural-urban barrier. One of the participants, literally he was coming from a very rural background, rural UP, and the only women he has seen in his life is wife and mother. These are very rural women within a patriarchal context. So when we were having conversation, the first thing he did is addressing me as Didi. And I was at the time visiting from the US. So even though I'm Indian, but the fact that I was visiting from the US to do this study, he was kind of had a sense of deference towards me and addressing me as Didi. And then he was also very like, my English is not very good. So the language issue also, and then quite interestingly, he started even coming up with some very, which was completely irrelevant to our interview, questions directed towards me. So, are you single, or did you ever drink? Because drinking is a, so all kinds of these kind of issues. Here I am trying to do interview, qualitative interview as part of a research project, but all these, social, cultural kind of issues were coming up. And then also something came up as part of the research process was also institutional practices of research and cultural barriers. In many institutions in India, still now there is no formalized institution of research ethics. So that once again creates an issue of building these relationships based on trust and agency. If you really would go with a ethics statement and ask somebody to sign, that immediately shuts people up over here within this context. So these are some of the issues. The paper is actually available, freely downloadable from Policy Futures in Education. It was published a few years ago. So these are some of the insights I wanted to share from the research. Thank you.
Thank you, Maushami. Power relations, socio-cultural divisions, we should discuss this in the Q&A as well. So moving forward, I will request my colleague, Professor John Clemmer, to share his views. He is a distinguished social anthropologist, has worked in multiple contexts, including Japan and the UK, and perhaps no better person to contrast the Asian and the European and maybe find some common ground as well, because he is now currently a faculty member here at Jindal University, but has seen quite a bit of cross-cultural internationalization and research initiatives. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Hiram, and good morning, everybody. And it's nice to actually see some faces here again who've been at previous meetings at Jindal. So welcome back, those of you who are returning as it were, for some time. I'll try to be brief, and I don't want to just repeat either platitudes or the kind of things my distinguished colleagues already said, but I have indeed had a very international career myself, having worked in the UK. Where have I worked? I can't remember now. So many places. In the UK, in Japan, in Singapore, and now here in India, and in between having spent periods as visiting professors in Argentina, in Germany, and in South Korea, and all sorts of places. So having seen a lot of these things on the ground, as it were, and I think it is interesting from that perspective to look at the actual nature of collaboration rather than, simply the sort of propaganda word which we all like. This is a good thing, and it is a good thing, obviously, as we've heard. And the fact that every student I've known who's gone abroad on an exchange, for example, has come back very enriched by that experience, even if it's just been a semester or something. It's deepened their worldview in all sorts of ways. But I think there are still some critical questions outstanding. Let me tell you what I think some of those briefly are. One is, of course, relevance. I found with international collaboration, the tendency is for the sort of subjects proposed to be themselves sort of high level in the sense that they are sort of international things, and not necessarily related to kind of grassroots interests. And it's probably because of maybe funding sources that tend to be attracted to those kind of things. And I think that is a real danger. Certain kinds of research can be produced and reproduced, leaving aside what are actually much more critical issues in the local context of any of the collaborating parties. I think also based on that is the sense of the equality of the collaboration itself, the genuineness of that collaboration. At least once, actually more than once I think, but at least once I was approached by a group of scholars who were they were applying for a very large grant from the British, is it still called the ESRC, the Economic Social Research Council? Lots and lots of money. And the project was quite interesting. I said, well, why do you want me? Is it because of my, incredibly distinguished career and all this kind of stuff? They said, no, we want a local person in India. So I think the idea was that I was the sort of nominal, person here, because they said, because what they want is a collaborative body of people who are going to be involved in this project. So you don't actually have to do anything, but basically, can we use your name? So, but this is not collaboration, right? This is fake, actually. In fact, in a sense, it's dishonest up to a point, right? Drawing people in when it's quite clear that the research objectives don't really involve very much about at least one of the partners in this collaborative project. Yeah. Having said that, I think there are all sorts of ways which I found not only in searching for these kind of research grants, but many other ways. Amongst the most fruitful things I've had in terms of scholarly collaboration have been jointly editing works with people, books that have come out with 2, 3, 4 editors. May sound like a lot, but that itself generates extraordinary amount of interchange between people. And I often think about this, where do ideas come from? And in fact, they often come from those kind of conversations and exploring things with other people that you would probably have never got into if you were not willing to expose yourself to something you're not necessarily a huge expert in already, but in fact is going to be a learning process itself. In fact, I thought that just before this meeting, just dangerous thing to do, glancing into your email, but amongst today's emails, there's requests to be an external examiner for a PhD in a British university. And I quite often do this, although it takes quite a lot of work. If you do it seriously, you really have to read the stuff, give sensible feedback and this kind of thing. But that alone, I think, is a form of solidarity, as you say, between scholars where you can, in fact, help each other. And I've always learned from the process of this because, of course, a good thesis is something that is going to teach you. And so I think that's important. I think Professor Sharma raised one very, very interesting question. And my impression is that internationally this is a shrinking thing, which is languages. With the relative hegemony of English, other languages have tended to drop out. I remember when I was an undergraduate student, one of the really hot languages, which I did study at the time, was Russian. Who do you find learns Russian now? Russian in European universities, it hasn't disappeared, but it's shrunk to this kind of almost nothing, And this is tragic, not simply the question of Russian, which would be quite a good language to know these days, again, right, having been through a kind of slump, as it were, is the fact that although much research may be in fact published or distributed in the sort of major metropolitan languages. A lot of very interesting stuff is not. How many people speak Hindi? Millions and millions and millions, right? And you'll find very few people outside India know any Hindi. As Sriram said, I lived in Japan for well over 20 years, and it's the same problem. Huge amount of very interesting research is generated in Japan, which is inaccessible to almost everybody because nobody else knows Japanese except Japanologists, generally speaking, right? And so that research, unless it's translated by somebody, is unknown largely. It does not appear. I will wrap up now. Right? Obviously, the importance of language is not only, being able to publish internationally. Again, this question you raised, why is a publication written in Hindi published in a journal here not as significant as something published in English in a journal which is considered of more international distribution? There are still those inequalities that I think we're very aware of. Just two concluding points then. One is that the nature of funding structures for collaborative research is still, I think, biased towards things which come from a particular source, that they're not in themselves internationalized. And so the way in which they're approached, who is likely to have access to those resources, how you find out where those sources are, is still biased. Not necessarily in a active sense, that we're trying to keep you people out. It's just that the funding structures, like indeed institutional structures, which are not necessarily geared to this. And you raised this question about ethics committees. I mean, I know someone who proposed a piece of ethical research, it was ethical, piece of collaborative research. She couldn't proceed with it because one of the host universities had no ethics committee. And one of the conditions of the granting body was that all of the collaborative bodies must have an ethics committee to review the research. She had to abandon the project simply for that institutional reason. My last question here is, a number of you raised this question of commercialization, but this is more Sriram's area than mine, is the question of soft power. The way in which research is used in experiences that I've experienced myself, in which it's a profile building thing, not necessarily to make money, but to expose particularly societies which are less well known internationally, possibly because their language is not well known, to create a kind of higher profile, which of course will naturally attract certain kinds of research, which again may not be the most relevant, but is tied to a more politicized agenda. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I certainly think we need to be aware of when there is a politicized agenda built into the structure of collaborative research. Thank you, Frank. I saw that.
Thank you, John. Vernaculars being ignored, and what are the donor interests in financing collaborative research projects? John pointed to possible elitism there, and the subject matters that are chosen for collaborative research may fall into some tick boxes that appeal to international or national donors, but may not necessarily generate the most interesting research. And one of the ways at Jindal University we've tried to overcome that is we have our own research grant policy. My colleague Professor Sudarshan heads that committee, and we evaluate grassroots focused research projects that may not get a Ford Foundation grant or a Asia Foundation or a USAID or JICA, but we can still, at least given our limited resources within the university, promote such original research that promotes throws light on lesser known aspects at the grassroots. Moving on, I will request a very special colleague of mine, Ambassador, Judge, a professor, the three monikers I know him by. Gudmund Eriksson. He was the the Icelandic ambassador to India. That was his last diplomatic posting, but also very distinguished scholar of the law of the seas, who has served on very important international tribunals, the UN bodies, and has also been teaching law of the seas to our students. And so he brings a unique perspective from a country that very few of us know up there in Scandinavia, but which also produces some very high quality research. And he's a product of that system. And the fact that he has come from up north, from the Arctic, all the way here to the tropics and continues to have wide relevance in his teachings and research is matter of honor for us. So over to you, Judge.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I, of course, was very pleased to be asked to participate in this particular session of this very important conference, because we'll be dealing with something which has, as you can hear, you heard already, my life's work, that is in international law, the development and interpretation of international law. And this is the body of law, which by very nature, you understand, is the antithesis of national law. So we have this dichotomy built into my profession, and but at the same time, something which is produced by the international community, now represented at the UN by 193 states. Well, Dr. Sharma pointed out the difficulty of dealing with 8 countries. Can you imagine, 193? This is a collaboration and a competition par excellence, if we take the title of our session. Now, not all 193 countries are involved in lawmaking, we'll say, but in the body of law which you referred to, in the law of the sea, there were easily 120 countries involved, and at least 80 of them very much involved. And besides having these great numbers, we decided not to do the quick process by taking votes and tallying positions of states. We decided to work by consensus. And this is a product of 10 years of that type of work. And then, of course, what better place to deal with these types of issues than as in the global university. We see the vision of our C. Raj Kumar, our founder, and as implemented by my colleagues here. Well, like Dr. Srivastava and others, I guess I'm a product of internationalization. I was a national of one country. I born and raised in a second country. I was educated in 2 other countries. I lived in 3 countries, ambassador of my country to another 10 countries. So you see, this is the perspective in which I'm dealing with this issue. Now,
what's the last country you will live?
well, this life. Well, what I want to put in perspective is how this kind of dichotomy has been addressed in the bodies which I have worked all my life. But before doing so, Chairman, you referred to the ongoing discussions in the United Nations where world leaders and so forth are addressing themselves. And I was struck while I was preparing the speech. I just happened to hear one of those leaders who phrased very, shall we say, clearly, one aspect of the discussion we're making. He said, and I quote, he said, quote, "The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, honor the differences that make each country special and unique." Of course, there's a lot of internal inconsistency there. But I guess you can say it's rather refreshing to see this so clearly. But this is the underlying reality of the work that I've been doing all my life. Not so often stated so clearly. But I must say I had some pleasure when the same person was interviewed leaving the UN building, and seemed to be somewhat aggrieved that all the attention about him during that period that he was there was not on the good work, within quotation marks, he had done that week in the UN, but some domestic issue involving another country, of course. Well, so there's 2 types, 2 ways in which, and again in my experience, this diversity has been addressed. Now, in all bodies of the UN are constituted under on the basis of what they call equitable geographical representation, and this means that regional groups are formally represented in each body, and these regional groups take this geographical distribution very seriously. And from my own experience, I can say that I became a judge in an international tribunal for the law of the sea, and the election to that body, which was set out in the Law of the Sea Convention, the time frame was postponed in order to be able to gather enough states amongst the parties to the treaty to be able to form one of the regional groups in the tribunal. So I'm saying it's taken very seriously, and in fact, there's probably only two bodies in the all of the UN where it's not formally divided by region. Now I can see how this is played out in my own work in this international tribunal. Like, time won't allow me to be too detailed, but very often you would see in the deliberations, you don't see this so much in the public discussions. You know, one said, well, what does it happen? How is this treated in Italy? How is this treated in Kenya? And so forth. It's a very important part of the deliberations of this body. Now, perhaps more importantly, as far as the development of international law is concerned, we have in the International Law Commission, in which I had the honor of participating for 10 years, laid down in the statute itself, Article 8, it says that in the Constitution of the International Law Commission, we must assure, and I quote, representations of the main forms of civilization and of the principal legal systems of the world. This is formally set out in the Constitution of the International Law Commission. Now, the work in the International Law Commission typically begins with a discussion of a paper prepared by the UN, setting out all the national laws on the topic being discussed. Again, I could give you many examples, but time won't allow me to do other than to say that in the project which I was very much involved in the International Law Commission, that is the development of the statute of the International Criminal Court, faced this dichotomy very clearly. Because as you know, there's nothing more national than criminal law. So having to put together one treaty in which all countries can feel that their views have been represented was quite a challenge. And you can see this in the draft the statute, the Rome Statute, as it was eventually adopted. Well, this type of discussion that I'm talking about now would never be complete without that main competition, which has been this. You heard already amongst the previous speakers the competition between the North and the South. Often phrased in the context of international law not having been developed by developing countries because of the colonial past. Now, I'm not going to deal with this now unless it comes up in the question and answer, because I do believe that is a dichotomy which has disappeared, and in particular because of the work on the international on the law of the sea. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judge. Indeed,